2915 Dying of the light. Arg. Sunny staggered, his mind reeling from the profane triumvirate of terror, pain, and the call. The oars of the chain breaker almost got away from him, but he managed to grasp them tightly at the last moment and steer the ship away from the falling corpse of a nightmare butterfly. A moment later, something dark and bloody struck one of the masts, shattering it, and was sent crashing into the deck. The thing rolled, leaving a bloody trail behind it, and came to a stop with a pained groan. That thing was Sunny, as well, one of his two winged incarnations that had been protecting the ship in the air. The blood left on the splintered wood moved like a living being, flowing back into his broken body. But it was of little use, since he had been hurt too severely. His wings had been destroyed, and his body was torn and mangled under the crumbling jade armor. He strained to stand up, but then toppled back to the deck with a stifled hiss. At least any of his arms seemed to be viciously broken, splinters of white bone protruding through torn skin, so leaning on it had been a mistake. Raising his bloodied face to give the incarnations piloting the chain breaker a grim look, Sunny allowed his battered avatar to collapse into a shadow and moved to wrap Saint into his dark embrace. That's 2 down, 5 to go. Things were not looking good for Sunny and Nephis. The chain breaker must have already climbed very far up the endless flat expanse of the Great Pyramid slope, far enough for him not to sense the echoes of the ferocious battle between Azarax and the Ash Tyrant, at least. But he could not sense the entrance to the interior of the tomb of Ariel, still. And he was not sure that they would continue fighting their way through the dreadful swarm of nightmare butterflies for much longer. Far away, deep in the dark stormfront of great abominations, the puppeteer was on the verge of being vanquished. The great moth's wings were so torn that it could barely keep itself in the air, and its movements were turning sluggish. It tried to keep the nightmare butterflies from coming close, but it was of no use. More and more of them were landing on The Puppeteer's titanic body, covering it like a ghastly, undulating carpet. The abominations were sinking their scythe-like legs into the sacred shade, rending it apart bit by bit. 2 of its legs had already been torn off, and now, one of the nightmare butterflies landed on its enormous compound eye, piercing the glittering onyx surface with a monstrous proboscis. The strings of black silk were dancing chaotically, unable to catch their prey anymore. In the distance, Slayer was in a similar condition. Her missing eye and shattered fangs only made her look more furious, but even if her murderous rage and chillingly cold killing intent had not abated one bit, only growing fiercer as time went by, she was slowly beginning to succumb to her wounds. Even as dozens of nightmare butterflies continued to fall prey to the stunning, malevolent obsidian dragon, the dragon was losing a piece of herself with each adversary she killed. Far above, Neph's blinding radiance was now completely obscured by the rustling mass of winged horrors, as if she had been swallowed by the swarm. Only a rare ray of radiant white light managed to through the impenetrable wall of monstrous butterflies, showing Sunny that she was still alive and fighting to clear a path for them. As for Sunny himself, he was not doing that GG either. In fact, he felt like he was ready to collapse. Serpent, protect that tree. The golden fruits of the sacred tree were already rolling on the deck. The chain breaker was climbing at a steep incline, so they all ended up near where Sunny was. Controlling the ship, feeling the air with a mouth-watering aroma. All he could taste on his tongue was blood, though, not because he was bleeding, but because his vanquished incarnations had been drowning in blood seconds before turning into intangible shadows. The chain breaker had already sustained damage, as well. Sunny had been using manifested shadows to operate the mighty siege engines installed on its deck, but most of those were gone now, torn from the deck and tossed overboard or utterly broken by the very nightmare butterflies they were meant to bring down. The hull was not breached yet, but it was already covered in scars. Several sections of the deck were damaged severely enough to be on the verge of crumbling. One of the masts was broken now, and the rest. Sunny did not know how much longer they would last. He struggled against the overwhelming desire to tear the blindfold off his eyes and look ahead. But he knew that he couldn't. The bestial panic that had usurped his heart was telling him not to. Damn it, they were so close. They were almost there, but also infinitely far away. So far away that there seemed to be no hope of ever making it to their goal. This can't. Before Sunny could finish the thought, an ominous sensation briefly overwhelmed him. It was the familiar sensation of a shade being drawn back into the dark abyss of his soul, of a shade that was not supposed to fall so soon. No, not yet, but there was no point in denying the inevitable. Far away, the puppeteer finally succumbed to its wounds. One of its wings was damaged too severely, so it broke, failing to support the great weight of the sacred shade in the devastating maelstrom of hurricane winds. Then, it was torn off completely, disappearing into the mass of nightmare butterflies. Having lost a wing, the puppeteer could not control its flight anymore, so it could not defend itself against the abominations, either. In a matter of seconds, its body was riddled with innumerable wounds and torn open, releasing a vast, billowing cloud of ghostly gray smoke into the lightless sky. Then, its silhouette grew indistinct, and it burst into a flood of darkness that washed over the heavens, flowing back into the vast and harrowing night. With the fall of the puppeteer, their defenses collapsed. A pillar of roaring white flame broke through the rustling mass of the nightmare swarm, preventing the abominations that the sacred shade had been holding back from descending upon the chain breaker immediately. Nephis moved closer to the ship, attempting to challenge twice as many enemies as she had been before, but it was of little use. She couldn't contain them all. This is bad. Sunny and his shadow butterflies were suddenly faced with many times more great abominations than they had already been struggling to keep away. The shades were being eviscerated at a frightening pace now, far faster than new shades were flowing into his soul. The two incarnations of Sunny who had been firing arrows from the deck of the flying ship took to the sky, as well, but even their presence was not enough to change the outcome. The defensive barrier around the chain breaker was dwindling and growing weaker with each moment. More and more great abominations made it to the flying ship, and even if Saint and Serpent slaughtered them promptly, the damage dealt to the graceful vessel slowly mounted. In the distance, Slayer was on the verge of being destroyed. Her obsidian scales were broken, and a torrent of ghostly smoke flowed out of her lethal maw instead of the merciless black flame. That was because her throat was torn wide open, more smoke spilling from the horrid wound. She was still full of bloodlust and malice, ready and willing to continue the slaughter, but Sunny did not want to see her destroyed. So, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and dismiss the malevolent shadow, sending her into the nurturing dark flames of his soul to be mended and restored. Rest well, Slayer. That left the avatars who had been augmenting Slayer alone in the depths of the nightmare swarm. Sunny attempted to make it back to the chain breaker by fusing the two incarnations into one, but in the end, he was a mangled wreck by the time he fell onto the fractured deck, shattered and broken so thoroughly that it seemed unnatural for him to still be alive. The agony of it all made the other incarnations tremble. These avatars, too, had to return to their natural state, the form of shadows. With both Slayer and Puppeteer gone, and the number of Sunny's incarnations still in the fight reduced to 4, the fate of the chain breaker was all but sealed. Even Nephis couldn't contain the harrowing swarm alone, and so, it wasn't long before she crashed into the deck and fell to her knees, her radiant wings shrouding her graceful figure like a tattered white cloak. The brilliant radiance of her skin was now weak and dim, and Sunny could see awful wounds that littered her body closing slowly as she drew in a shaking breath and turned her gaze to him, much slower than they usually would. Her essence was all but exhausted. He tried to compose himself for a moment, pushed the pain that consumed his whole being down, and then rolled one of the golden fruits toward her. Sunny forced out a pale smile. Not that satisfying, as far as last meals go, but I hear these things are delicious. Nephis studied him for a moment, then nodded, picked up the fruit, and bit into it. By the time she stood up, her wounds were noticeably smaller, and a white tunic had already formed around her body from the sparks of light. Above them, 3 incarnations of Sunny and the remaining shades were making their last stand. Serpent and Saint were still defending the deck, which was now littered with the towering, severed corpses of the nightmare butterflies. The sail that had been connected to the shattered mast was fluttering in the wind, torn and tattered. Nephis turned to the bow of the ship and leaned forward to keep balance on the inclined deck, resting one hand on the slick wood. She remained silent for a short moment, and then said in a hoarse, emotionless voice, "I see the breach. 2916 into the breach." Sunny barely prevented himself from swaying, a feeble flame of hope igniting in his heart. His mind was screaming at him to let out a sigh of relief, but he knew better than to make that mistake. It was too early to feel relief, to allow himself a moment of respite from the draining burden of being ready for the worst. The treacherous relief people surrendered themselves to just before reaching safety had reaped countless lives. "Did you really find it? The breach?" Nephis nodded. "Yes, we are close." She finished the golden fruit and reached for another. "I saw where the nightmare butterflies are spilling from. It's the second claw mark from the top. If they can leave the tomb from there, it means that we can enter." Sunny inhaled deeply. So we found the entrance, after all. His thoughts were interrupted by Neff's even, impassive voice. "They are still pouring out of the breach like a flood. And there would be far more of them inside the pyramid than there are outside. Do you understand what that means?" Holding the oars, Sunny nodded. "I do. It meant that the density of the nightmare swarm would be incomparably greater as they neared the breach, and that the last push would be the most perilous. Nephis exhaled slowly through gritted teeth. Bring us to the breach. I will clear the way. Instead of answering, Sunny shuddered. Somewhere above them, another of his incarnations had become a shapeless mass of bleeding flesh. His right arm was torn off, and his right leg was severed below the knee. His armor was shattered, so the rest of his body was a gruesome sight to behold, as well. The pain, the pain. He did not even feel that much of the pain anymore, because he had lost most of his mind to the call. Pain was meaningless in the face of the alluring, irresistible pull of the nightmare. And there was terror, as well. You'll need to guide me. Nephis nodded and raised her hand slowly, calling upon the blessing once more. I will. Sunny raised his head, as if wanting to see himself being torn apart. Now, only 3 of his incarnations remained whole, 1 steering the chain breaker, 2 leading the dwindling number of shadow butterflies in the defense of the flying ship. He just needed to hold on a little bit longer. But he couldn't. His own power was simply not enough to resist the harrowing, endless sea of great abominations. The most effective tool for dealing with large amounts of enemies at his disposal was the curse, but even if he channeled his killing intent through it to poison the nightmare butterflies with his death will, they would not succumb to it quickly, or even at all. They were of equal rank to him, after all, and possessed their own will. In fact, the collective will of the nightmare swarm, its spirit, was far greater than his. Sunny could recall the shadows he had left behind to defend those people who were precious to him. Nightmare, fiend, but even if he made that sacrifice, their powers were ill-suited for this aerial battle, and so, they would fail to turn the tide. So, a different kind of sacrifice was needed. Sunny remained silent for a while, following Neff's instruction to steer the chain breaker toward one of the 4 titanic claw marks that marred the surface of the tomb of Ariel, then said quietly. Serpent. Saint was powerful, but her strength could not be expressed fully without solid ground beneath her feet. Serpent, meanwhile, excelled at adaptability and versatility. Serpent was versatility itself, really. Granted, Sunny did not command that many powerful shades that were adept at aerial combat. The best of them were the shades of the nightmare butterflies themselves, the obsidian wasps, the corrupted titan, defiled seeker of truth. And the winter beast. The winter beast, who commanded winds and could turn an entire realm into a frigid hell. A titan who possessed incredible power, but was weak and fragile behind the terrifying shield of its lethal blizzard. Slow them down, serpent. As soon as he said those words, a cold wind blew across the deck of the chain breaker, and snowflakes glistened in the dark. An inconceivable, ghastly, eerily beautiful creature forged from black ice briefly revealed itself above the deck of the flying ship, its vast expanse blooming with myriad azure flowers. A moment later, it was hidden from view by a whirlwind of snow, rising slowly into the dark sky. Sunny bit his lip as he watched Serpent soar into the tenebrous depths of the nightmare swarm. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the howling of the winds changed its tone, turning far more chilling and vicious. The frigid winds assaulted the abominable butterflies, encasing their wings in a thin layer of ice. Near the heart of the unnatural blizzard, the temperature dropped to 0, the absolute 0, not the arbitrary state humans had assigned that number for the sake of convenience. Serpent moved away from Sunny and the shadow butterflies, unleashing the full fury of the winter beast's profane powers upon the terrifying swarm. Almost instantly, the pressure on the defenders of the flying ship diminished. Back in Antarctica, during the final battle of the siege of Falcon Scott, Sunny had failed to get anywhere near the heart of the blizzard, and therefore to the winter beast. But he had been merely ascended now. The nightmare butterflies were all great nightmare creatures, and could wield the will more effectively than the winter beast could. A corrupted titan could be considered a more powerful creature when compared to a great beast, or even a monster, but when there were so many beasts and monsters around, it would inevitably be torn apart. Sunny just hoped that Serpent would remain whole long enough to allow the chain breaker to enter the breach, and that he would be able to dismiss his loyal shadow before it was entirely destroyed. Hopefully, he would not be late. His heart was cold and heavy, but Sunny forbade himself from thinking about what would happen if he were. He was not afforded the luxury of second-guessing his decisions, and there was no time to look back. We are almost there. In the stark coldness of the frigid winds, Neff's voice rang like clear crystal. Get ready. Behind them, Serpent and its murderous blizzard were being assaulted by the nightmare swarm. The abominations there were weakened and debilitated, so only a few of them could still pursue the chain breaker. In front of them, however, now, Sunny could sense the flawlessly flat surface of the tomb of Ariel, torn and ravaged. There were 4 gargantuan, deep canyons marring the vast expanse of black stone. His goal was the depths of the third one, from where the endless tide of nightmare butterflies was pouring into the world. And these butterflies were not only countless, but also untouched by the blizzard, as terrifying and strong as could be. Hold tight. Sunny sent a torrent of essence into the runic circle of the chain breaker and grabbed the oars tightly, prepared to make the last push. Above him, his 2 incarnations readied themselves to dive into the densest, most impenetrable part of the nightmare swarm. When they delved into the obliterating flood of great abominations, it was unlike anything Sunny had experienced before. He had known that it would be bad, but still underestimated the sheer vicious impossibility of the task. The shadow butterflies were wiped out almost in an instant. His incarnations held fast a little longer, but in a matter of moments, they were gruesomely savaged, as well. One barely escaped back to the deck of the chain breaker, the other was so severely damaged that it could not even retreat. Abandoning her bow, Saint leapt into the air and grabbed the mangled remains of Sunny's avatar. He dismissed his corporeal form and wrapped his tattered shadow around her, dazed and blinded by the pain. Saint was left open in the air, and a moment later, she already received a terrifying blow. A cloud of ruby dust spread around her and was instantly carried away by the winds. As Saint's wounded form plummeted back toward the flying ship, Sunny dismissed her and drew all of his shadows to his last remaining avatar, the one holding the oars. Somewhere far behind, a nightmare butterfly finally pierced the lethal blizzard and descended upon the icy figure of Serpent, shattering the black ice with its scythe-like legs. More followed. But by then, the chain breaker had finally reached the third of the titanic Claw-Maw GKS and careened, plummeting into the depths of the canyon. Toward the spot where the nightmare butterflies were the densest, and therefore where the breach that led to the interior of the tomb of Ariel lay. Nephis, now, throwing away the stem of a golden fruit, she lunged forward and reached the bow of the flying ship in the blink of an eye. There, Nephis placed one foot on the railing to keep herself balanced, inhaled deeply, and then raised the blessing, grasping its hilt with both hands. In the next moment, the world was drowned in blinding light. The world was shattered by the roaring flame. Sunny's eyes were burned even through the blindfold, and his ears were momentarily deafened. The cold air was suddenly scorching hot and searing, and smelled faintly of ash. And the path in front of the chain breaker was suddenly clear. Sensing Nephis' sway and toppling to the deck, Sunny threw the flying ship into the breach, into the rough tunnel formed by shattered, glowing, incandescent black stone. That stone had been the flesh of an unholy titan once, so Sunny did not even want to think what could have shattered it. He dismissed the serpent, knowing that his shadow was severely damaged, but, hopefully, not irrevocably so. Come on, come on. The chain breaker plummeted into the darkness, the walls of the tunnel growing closer and closer around it. And then, in the darkness, Sunny sensed a vast, endless expanse, and myriad shadows of the nightmare butterflies rising to tear them apart. No, gritting his teeth, he called upon the shadows and manifested a dark shield in front of the flying ship, a shield that was really a ram. Just a heartbeat later, the chain breaker collided with the rising tide of nightmare butterflies, groaning under pressure as its shield fractured and fell apart. The flying ship finally escaped into the vast darkness of the tomb of Ariel, where millions of nightmare butterflies rest on the endless expanse of black stone. A myriad of them rose to destroy the flying ship, but Sunny aimed it down, toward the heart of the vast darkness, where the great river was supposed to flow endlessly, illuminated by 7 radiant suns. It was strange, though. He could not see the suns. He could not see anything, really. Where is it? The chain breaker rushed away from the breach and from the walls of the tomb of Ariel, pursued by a dreadful trail of nightmare butterflies. It was as if a colossal tentacle of seething darkness separated itself from the interior walls of the Great Pyramid and stretched toward the fleeing ship, aiming to catch and destroy it before it got too far. Now, it all depended on which was faster, the chain breaker or the pursuing mass of great abominations. On the bow of the ship, Nephis moved weakly and rose to her knees, using the blessing to support herself. On its stern, Sunny gripped the oars so tightly that their handles cracked. He was overcome by pain and exhaustion. But, magically enough, his mind was at peace. That was because as soon as they entered the interior of the tomb of Ariel, the call had gone silent. The unbearable terror of being close to the 7th seed abated, as well. Sunny was full of a blissful, soothing feeling of relief. Ah, he could not have even imagined that kind of bliss before. Nephis, he did not get to finish the sentence. Just then, a nightmare butterfly crashed into the side of the chain breaker, and another one rammed its bottom. Another one climbed onto its deck and thrust a scythe-like leg at Sunny. The flying ship spun out of control, throwing him into the air. That was where the terrible blow caught him, assaulting him with horrid pain. His consciousness was briefly extinguished. When Sunny came back to his senses, he was falling through the darkness, spinning, dazed and completely disoriented. He could not sense anything around him, and neither could he see anything. Right, that was because he was still wearing the blindfold. I should probably take it off, now. It was then that a familiar, ominous feeling suddenly overwhelmed him. Sunny opened his eyes wide. No, no way. That was when he hit the water, sending a towering geyser of it rising hundreds of meters into the air, and was pulled into its cold, dark depths. Single quote. God damn it, not again. He had finally made it back to the Great River. 2917 The final battle of the last war. The final battle of the last war had begun. It was the final battle because neither side was willing to retreat, and it was the last war because no matter which side won, humanity was doomed to be destroyed by the victor. Most of the soldiers fighting for the Hunger Domain did not know that, of course, and those who did were incapable of rebelling against their sovereign. Were incapable of feeling rebellious, even, their minds poisoned and twisted by the insidious power of the Dreamspawn. The battle began slowly, as if both armies were stretching their titanic bodies before throwing themselves into the fight. On the islands surrounding the Great Chasm of the Tear, the boundless army of the Hunger Domain was slowly assembling into 7 assault formations. The beautiful silhouette of the Ivory Island loomed in the sky above, and on the opposite side of the chasm, the Night Garden was prowling in the sky below. There were 7 titanic chains that connected the Ebony Tower to the rest of the chain isles, drawn taut as they stretched across the vast expanse of the Tear. If the aerial assault failed, the warriors of humanity would have to stage a 7-pronged attack, advancing toward the enemy's last stronghold across these chains. The chains were truly colossal, each one as wide as a great bridge, but they still offered limited space, especially considering the size of the creatures that would clash atop them. In a battle like this one, 7 powerful combatants could stop an entire army. Of course, the besieging army had powerful combatants of their own, so it would not be stopped. On one of the islands, Seishan was preparing to lead her warriors to victory. Somewhere else, Morgan of Valor was looking at the distant silhouette of the Ebony Tower, her scarlet eyes shining with a cold, sharp killing intent. Wake of Ruin was observing the darkness of the Great Chasm with a somber expression. On a different island, Old Jest was trying to come up with a joke. He was drawing a blank, though. That had never happened to him before, but after he finally saw the light and accepted the Dreamspawn as his lord, the world didn't seem that funny anymore, for some reason. There were saints of storied legacy clans, like Whitefeather or Aegis Rose, and those who had risen to fame in recent years as well. There were countless warriors of lesser ranks, too. Among them were the Fire Keepers, the Blood Sisters, the Wolves, the Night Singers, and countless other awakened forces, renowned or not. On one of the islands, an ordinary awakened warrior sighed and thrust his sword into the ground, then leaned his shield against it. His enemy was Yutra, and his arms were tired from holding the weapons. He could have dismissed them, of course, but what if there was some kind of ambush? Dying while your memories were manifesting was a very frustrating way to go. When are they going to start? The awakened near him seemed to share his thoughts. Yutra glanced over and scrunched his brow. Hey. His eyes suddenly glistened with excitement that he couldn't quite explain. Don't I know you? The awakened stared at him with a scowl. What the, wait, you do seem familiar. Have we met before? Yutra tried to remember where he had seen the man, but before he could, a third voice interrupted his thoughts. Do both of you suffer from dementia, by any chance? The one speaking was a woman with grim eyes, a bit younger than both of them, leaning on a spear a few meters away. That's Tegrot, and I'm Rit. We all met at that quarantine facility. Yutra's eyes shone. Right, we were there together. It's just that our memories were wiped, so I couldn't quite remember. Rit scoffed quietly. The last shift wasn't wiped, was it? We all sat near each other when Lady Kashia announced that the facility was closing. Tegrot suddenly grinned. You're Yutra. You're the one who brought out the synth beer during the farewell party. He shook his head in amazement. What are the chances, All 3 of them looked to the distant, dark silhouette of the Ebony Tower. After a long stretch of silence, Rit sighed. Kinda hard to believe, right? That we're about to storm the lair of the King of Nothing. Do you think that it's true, what they are saying about Lady Kashia? That she betrayed us and is serving that monster now? Tegrot looked away with a dark expression. If it is, I guess we'll be helping kill her today. Yutra studied them for a few moments, then shook his head. What are you talking about? Don't listen to anyone who calls Our Lady a traitor. Those people are all fools. She was obviously kidnapped by that sick bastard and is being held captive by him, forced to help him against her will, so we are not helping kill her. We are going to defeat the King of Nothing and rescue her, okay? Rit seemed to feel better after hearing that. She nodded, and then smiled tentatively. Yeah, Lord Astarion won't let anything bad happen to her. I'm sure of it. Tegrot, meanwhile, studied the sky. Look, they're starting. High above them, and all around them, the siege of the Ebony Tower was indeed starting. The cannons of the Night Garden thundered in the distance, as if a great storm had descended upon the Chained Isles, and a dark haze of arrows fell down from the heavenly shores of the Ivory Island. On the ground, as well, those who could send a projectile flying across the great dark chasm were raising their bows, hoisting their javelins up, spinning their slings, or summoning the awesome powers of their aspects. There were not too many of them, but most were of the transcendent rank, so, when they unleashed the first volley, the sight of it was humbling and terrifying to behold. And that was before the two Supremes entered the battle personally. At that, a cold wind blew across the world, making Yutra sway and hurriedly pick up his weapons. He lowered the visor of his helmet and sighed. Gods, it's like the world is coming to an end. Tegrot nodded slowly. Yeah, he remained silent for a few moments, and then shrugged. But that's what, fifth time we witnessed the world coming to an end. I am not going to lie, watching the world end gets old pretty quickly. Yutra laughed. True, but, hey, at least we're in good company this time. You know, I'm really glad to have run into you too, for some reason. On the other side of the tear, Mordred and Cassie watched the cloud of arrows descend upon them while devastating cannonballs were barreling at them from the other side. The Ebony Island was much larger than the Ivory Island, and its vast and desolate expanse was currently flooded by the vessels of the King of Nothing. Cassie was in front of the great tower, standing in the runic circle she herself had carved into the weathered obsidian. Mordred, his original vessel, was nearby, having donned a suit of intricate black armor and summoned an eerie spear with a long, leaf-shaped blade. The somber steel of the blade was polished and reflected the world upon itself, glistening dimly in the golden radiance of dawn. Leaning on the spear, Mordred was observing the great army of humanity with an amused smile playing on his lips. I guess the old man wants to do things properly. He looked at the 7 figures that were arrayed in front of them, each facing him with an absent expression. Those figures were his reflections, each of them a supreme beast, at least. Mordred created the reflections out of his own soul cores, so each of them was born of the same rank as him. In a sense, the process was not that different from his transformation ability, the ability to splinter his soul to possess multiple vessels at the same time. However, the reflections were independent beings. They possessed the unique ability to mirror other creatures, which Mordred himself lacked, but perhaps even more importantly than that, they could grow and evolve over the course of their lives. That meant that even if they were born the same rank as their creator, they could rise in both rank and class. In fact, they had a much easier time attaining higher ranks than Mordred himself, because they were creatures, not humans. All they had to do was absorb the essence of other beings. The slower, much more difficult way to do so was to thoroughly reflect and embody the being they were mirroring, slowly assimilating its essence. The easier and faster way was simply to kill living beings and absorb their spark, not too different from how humans absorb soul fragments by shattering the souls of nightmare creatures, or receive them directly by killing other humans. Or how the nightmare creatures absorbed souls by slaughtering all living things. That quality of the reflections had often served Mordred in the past, allowing him to command servants more powerful than he was. However, it had become quite difficult to nurture his reflections after he became a supreme. That was for one simple reason: there had been great amounts of dormant, awakened, ascended or fallen, and even transcendent or corrupted beings for his servants to slaughter before. However, there were very few supreme or great beings in the world, not enough of them to fuel the growth of the reflections, at least, especially because the more entrenched in existence a being was, the more they benefited from destroying it. Much like humans benefited more when killing humans with fully saturated soul cores, as opposed to recently awakened greenhorns. Godgrave had few of such ancient beings left, most of them concentrated in the Spine Ocean, where even the reflections could be easily destroyed at any moment. That was the reason why he had failed to make any of his reflections sacred, and that was the reason why they were of relatively lower classes, as well, even if the sum of the soul cores between them had far outgrown the initial 7 he had sacrificed to create them. But even as supreme, the reflections were an immensely powerful force. Especially so because of how versatile they were. Just before the cannonballs reached the Ebony Island, they exploded in the air, as if having collided with an invisible wall. The same happened to the arrows sent from the Ivory Island, and to the storm of projectiles sent from the neighboring islands. That was because, at the moment, most of the reflections assumed the shape of a person Cassie knew quite well, of Rivalan, the noble saint of the Aegis Rose clan, whose power allowed him to create a wall of ethereal shields around a target or around a place he wanted to protect. Saint Rivalan was powerful, but not powerful enough to surround the entire Ebony Island with his Aegis. The reflections working in tandem while channeling his aspect, however. That was an entirely different conversation. Especially because one of the reflections, the one that existed longer than the rest, was of a higher class than the rest, and therefore had the greatest claim at personhood than they had, was not mirroring Saint Rivalan of Aegis Rose. Instead, it was mirroring a different saint, a far more dangerous saint. It was mirroring Cassie. 2918 Siege of the Ebony Tower. A perfect version of Cassie stood opposite her, looking at her with one remaining eye. It possessed the same powers as her, and even if the reflection was not quite as adept as her at manipulating human memories, how could it be, when the very concept of humanity was alien to it? It did wield the power to see a few seconds into the future. It also possessed the power to communicate what it sensed to other reflections and Mordred himself, which allowed them to apply the power of Rivalan with a level of foresight and precision that made it many times more efficient, and therefore far more effective. The cataclysmic barrage of the Hunger Domain continued for some time, unleashing such terrifying forces that a hurricane wind rose around the Ebony Island, tearing apart the clouds far in the sky and drowning the world in a suffocating, sweltering heat. The Dreamspawn seemed willing to take things slowly and probe the defenses of his enemy at a leisurely pace. The man was as arrogant as he was terrifying, after all. Cassie had no doubt that he already felt like victory was in his hands. She couldn't blame him, really. From where she stood, Astarion's victory seemed all but inevitable, as well. I wonder what he'll try next. Mordred's voice sounded almost lazy. They received the answer soon. The cannonade slowly died down, and the sky cleared from the dark veil of raining arrows. Instead, an eerie sensation permeated the air, as if the world itself was under assault. Cassie inhaled deeply and poured her essence into the runic circle, activating the defensive enchantments she had put in place. At the same time, the reflections, all except the one mirroring her own delicate figure, seemed to ripple and transform, turning into a handsome man with dark skin and beautiful, silver eyes. They had assumed the shape of Nightwalker. Somewhere far away, aboard the Night Garden, he was attempting to bend space to deliver the great army of humanity on Mordred's doorstep. However, Cassie's runic array had reinforced space around the Ebony Tower, making it more static and far less malleable. The legendary founder of the House of Night might have been able to overcome her sorcery eventually, but the reflections were acting against him as well. They used the same aspect to counteract his power. In fact, they went one step further and used it to launch a counter-offensive, twisting space to rip the Night Garden apart. In a matter of seconds, it was the Nightwalker who was on the defensive, not the other way around. The fabric of the world rippled and groaned, torn between two merciless forces. Cassie felt her hair stand on end, while Mordred sighed deeply. This is a little tedious. Is he trying to make me die of sheer boredom? Cassie, who was straining to feed essence to the runic circle she had carved, turned to him briefly. Why don't you make it more exciting, then? Mordred grinned. You were reading my thoughts. Of course, she wasn't. If anyone was reading Mordred's mind, it was Astarion. That was the very reason why this battle felt so unwinnable. How were they supposed to defeat an opponent who knew their every move in advance? Then again, Cassie could roughly predict what Astarion would do, as well. Get ready. He has simply been testing the waters before. The next attack will be the true opening blow. It would probably be the crushing. Astarion could not obliterate the Ebony Island with the crushing, its power was proportional to how near one was to the Ivory Tower, after all, so he would have to bring the Heavenly Citadel quite close to the enemy's stronghold in order to deal substantial damage. And at that distance, Mordred would have all kinds of ways to enter the Tower of Hope and make it his, turning the crushing upon the army of the Hunger Domain. Astarion could still unleash the crushing to make his enemies fight under a tremendous burden, though, even if they were not going to be instantly destroyed. Mordred seemed to share Cassie's opinion of what the Dreamspawn would do next. Subject the Ebony Island to the crushing, then send his soldiers into a direct assault. So, instead of waiting for the attack, Mordred made a move of his own. Instead of concentrating on defending his stronghold, he attacked before the enemy could. The mirror realm hidden in his soul was connected to all reflections he could reach, and he could reach any reflection on the Chained Isles. So, it wasn't difficult for him to open pathways to several of those reflections and unleash the horde of his vessels into the world. Suddenly, violence descended onto the emerald grass of the Ivory Island, onto the deck of the Night Garden, and on several of the islands surrounding the Ebony Tower. A tide of nightmare creatures escaped from the reflections, lunging at the warriors of the human domain. Of course, the result of that sudden attack was not entirely devastating, because Astarion had known that it was coming in advance. But simply because he had known about it did not mean that he could easily squash it. One needed power to act on foreknowledge, after all, and while the Hunger Domain granted its master unparalleled power, far greater power than any other domain in existence could grant a supreme, it was not that superior to the Mirror Domain as far as pure combat strength of its subjects went. In fact, it could even be considered inferior in that regard. All the human saints, masters, and awakened were technically incapable of resisting the tide of great abominations Mordred had subjugated in Godgrave, let alone his 7 supreme reflections. But the devil hid in the details. In this case, it hid in the power of the Dreamspawn. Astarion was not only capable of controlling his thralls in a way that granted them an eerie degree of coherence and unity. He was also capable of imbuing them with his thoughts and emotions, and therefore with his will, making all of them its conduits. Which meant that each subject of his domain was capable of far more than their rank usually allowed. A chain of vicious, bloody skirmishes exploded in the vicinity of where Mordred had opened the doors to his mirror realm. Those skirmishes were fierce, temporarily preventing Astarion from using the Night Garden and the Ivory Island effectively in the battle. But even as Mordred's forces struggled for control of the 2 great citadels, the rest of the vast army of the Hunger Domain remained unperturbed. And so, Astarion gave it the command to attack. Before the 7 great assault forces stepped onto the celestial chains, dark clouds rose from the islands neighboring the rifts. They were the winged echoes, the nightmare creatures Beastmaster had enthralled, and those Astarion had mesmerized as well, a great swarm of them, terrifying enough to blot out the sun and cast a deep shadow over the Chained Isles. Standing in front of the gates of the Ebony Tower, Mordred smiled, the darkness of the approaching swarm reflecting in his eyes. Well, now things are getting interesting. Ah, what a day to be alive. He paused for a moment, and then added with a subtle hint of vicious glee in his pleasant voice. And to die, as well. Somewhere far away, Sunny found himself lost in a vast, cold darkness. He was deep underwater, with no idea which direction the surface was, and close to no air in his burning lungs. Well, to be fair, this was the Great River, at least he thought that it was. So, the surface was in every direction. It just depended on how long he would have to swim to reach it. The last time Sunny had plunged into the depths of the Great Geivere, he had been ready, summoning the Essence Pearl almost immediately to prevent himself from suffocating. This time, even if he had the Quintessence Pearl in his soul arsenal, there was no real need to summon it. He was a supreme, after all, so he simply burned a little essence to satiate his body, relaxing as he drifted in the boundless darkness. Everything hurt. He had not been hurt this badly in a long while. No, actually, he had not been hurt this badly since a few weeks ago. The Wandering Archon had done a good number on him, as well. My life has been quite eventful as of late, huh? Was being a king always this painful? Having spent a few moments drifting aimlessly in the dark water, Sunny let out a mental sigh and pushed out what little air was left in his lungs. Noting in which direction the air bubbles moved, he closed his eyes for a moment, and then chased after them. That was where the nearest surface was, it seemed. 2919 The Last Realm. Breaching the surface, Sunny relaxed his body and drifted in the cold water for a long while, doing nothing but breathing deeply. His mind was empty, and a languid, comfortable stillness overcame his entire being. The utter darkness that surrounded him, the cold water that soothed his bruised body, the weightlessness, all of it was so peaceful. As if he were drifting in an endless, tranquil void. Sunny allowed himself to remain in that pleasantly numb state for some time, knowing from the movement of shadows, or rather, from the lack of it, that there were no threats around him. Now that the danger was gone, both his body and mind needed to rest. It was no surprise, really, he had been under tremendous pressure for a long while now, and that pressure culminated when he returned to the hell of Ariel. Those past weeks were unlike anything he had ever experienced. Sunny had visited some truly terrifying places over the course of his eventful life, places that no human was ever meant to endure. The Death Game, the bottom of the Stormsia, the Eternal City. But nothing had tested him quite like the Nightmare Desert. Not on that scale, at least. It had taken 3 powerful Supremes to make it to the heart of hell, and even then, they had only survived by the skin of their teeth. There had not been a single night that failed to leave them with deep scars, and not a single battle in which their lives had not been at stake. How the hell did Darren make it inside? Sunny's voice sounded quiet in the vast silence. He knew that the Serpent King had been the only Supreme of the Storm Realm. He also knew that Darren had been both powerful and ingenious. Still, he couldn't quite imagine how the ancient Supreme could have made it inside the tomb of Ariel alive. He would have been far away from his natural element, after all, since there was no water anywhere in the boundless desert. Then again, the desert had been the bottom of an ocean once. So, perhaps Darren was quite comfortable here. After drifting in the comfortable darkness for a while, Sunny came to the conclusion that there was little point in contemplating the Serpent King's power in relation to himself or Nephis, because the very nature of power had changed since the days of the Twilight Sea. The 3 of them simply existed in different realities. It was not even about who was stronger, but more about the source and foundation of their strength. Sunny did not know the order in which the nightmare, and therefore the nightmare spell, had consumed the divine realms. What he did know, however, was that the war realm was unique. It was unique because its laws rejected the existence of all things that went against the mundane. It was a sanctuary for humans, and a place where humans could freely express their intellect and ingenuity, safe from the tyranny of transcendent wills. A world of immutable reason, a beautiful world where no one, not even the gods, could dictate how mortals lived, and people were free to choose for themselves what path to take. Even if those paths often led them to bloodshed and strife, they had achieved so much, invented so much, built and created so much, more than any other realm had. But their isolation also made them different from those who had inhabited the Twilight Sea once. Unlike people of Earth, who had to discover the vast and dreadful world that lay beyond the boundaries of their cradle from the position of utter ignorance, Darren the Serpent King had been born into it. He had been born into the legacy of knowledge they were still trying to learn or had no idea about. Awakened, soul essence, corruption, the void, shaping, sorcery, Darren had possessed an innate understanding of all these matters, and many more, while Sunny and Nephis were merely novices to them. He had inherited the knowledge, disciplines, and skills developed by countless generations of awakened over the course of thousands of years, from the dawn of time till the end of the world. And past it. No matter how much Sunny and Nephis learned, fathomed, and invented themselves, the accumulation of their knowledge could not compare to such a fundamental, civilizational legacy, even if the spell was there to help breach the gap. Not yet, at least, and not for a long while. That was their disadvantage when compared to the great giants of the ancient past, but it was an advantage, as well. Because they lacked a foundation in all things having to do with the sublime, they were left no choice but to do with what they had. Theirs was a much harsher world, a world where the stakes were much more stark, much more absolute. It was always all or nothing, do or die. Nothing stood behind the people of their world, so they could only rely on themselves. As a result, they had been forged into much sharper blades. So, it was not that Darren had been far stronger than they were, or that they were far stronger than he had been. It was just that the ingredients of their strength were different, and so, its nature was different as well. Darren had probably been capable of doing many things that Sunny and Nephis couldn't do, and they, in turn, were capable of many things he would have never been able to accomplish. That said, I still killed him, though. So who's the meanest bastard of them all, in the end? Sunny chuckled. Granted, he had killed the nightmare version of Darren while the poor man was already corrupted, completely insane, and almost dead, but then again, Sunny himself had only been a master at the time, so that had to count for something. Having finished contemplating the astonishing fate of Darren, the Serpent King, Sunny sighed and finally emerged from the state of pleasant relaxation, deciding that it was time to start thinking about the present again. First, he assessed his condition. His condition wasn't great. It was terrible, really. 6 of his 7 incarnations had suffered such catastrophic damage that he could not manifest them at the moment. His soul was in shambles, barely held together by soul weave. The Shadow Legion was completely eradicated, and at least a week would have to pass before it was mended to full strength. Saint, Slayer, and even Serpent were wounded so grievously that he could not call upon them, either. Thankfully, all 7 links of the curse were augmenting the dark flames of his soul, so the rate at which his shades and shadow varied was greatly enhanced. Saint especially would be back on her feet soon due to her own powers, so, all things considered, he had escaped hell in good shape. Despite how hurt and battered Sunny and everyone he commanded were, nothing was irrevocably lost. Everything could be repaired and brought back, eventually. Which brought him to the next point on the agenda. Assessing the world around him. Right, something was seriously wrong with the world. 2920 Expectations versus reality. Sunny had not known what to expect from the Tomb of Ariel, the real Tomb of Ariel, not the phantom of it conjured by the nightmare spell, but he at least knew what not to expect, which allowed him to make some predictions. First and foremost, the difference between the real Great River and the Great River he encountered in the third nightmare was the role Darren the Serpent King had played in the fate of the river people. Darren had made it across the white sands of the Hell of Ariel and entered Ariel's tomb in the company of his strongest champions, those like his daughter, Windflower. By doing so, they left an imprint of themselves on the Great River, which meant that a version of them would exist in all nightmares that took place there. His people, meanwhile, the entire population of the Twilight Sea that still remained, made their way to the giant block of black stone that lay among the dunes, containing a seed of nightmare, and challenged it. It was the same seed Sunny and the members of his cohort had challenged after the Battle of the Black Skull. The survivors of the Twilight Sea could do so because, unlike their supreme, they did not have to reach the Tomb of Ariel itself. So, they did not need to traverse the nightmare desert at night, when the Deathless rose from beneath the sand to engage in the eternal battle. That must have been a terrifying pilgrimage, still, and one that could not have been completed without countless people accomplishing countless astounding feats. But they did succeed, in the end, and a legion of challengers entered the nightmare of the Great River, where the phantoms of King Darren and his saints were already waiting for them. That was how Twilight was founded, becoming the core of resistance against the defilement, in the nightmare, that was. There was no Twilight in the real Tomb of Ariel, though. They couldn't be. Darren and his saints were still here, had been here, at least, but there was no vast army of outsiders to battle the defilement. There was no Nephis, either, and as far as Sunny knew, she was the only one capable of destroying the first Seeker, Aletheia of the Nine, without succumbing to corruption. There were only the river people. The cities that were ruled by the Sibyls, who were destined to succumb to the whispers of the estuary themselves, and Weave, the city where the cultists of the nightmare spell lived. So, even if there were no plagues in the real Tomb of Ariel, no dread lord, no torment, no soul stealer, no undying slaughter, no devouring beast, and no mad prince either, Sunny did not count the chances of the river civilization high. It was most likely already gone, having been consumed by the forces of the defilement. The whole Great River would be a seething mass of nightmare creatures by now. And since there was no mad prince here, there would be no piece of flotsam for him to clutch onto, either. No field of demented runes carved into it, and no warning to be careful of what he wished for. It was too late for Sunny to heed that warning, anyway. Right, and then there was the most important difference, one that Sunny was wary of the most. The vile thieving bird. The phantom of it had made a nest in the estuary of the illusory Great River, but now, that phantom was in the real world, having escaped the nightmare. There was no telling what the loathsome creature had done, how it had changed the Great River, and what it was doing at the moment. The only thing Sunny was sure of was that the thieving bird was still in the Tomb of Ariel. There was a very simple reason why he believed that. If a cursed terror that even the gods had despised escaped into the dream realm, humanity would have felt the consequences of its freedom very soon. What would the odious thieving bird have stolen first? Would it have taken all the pretty eyes in existence as its prize? Or just absconded after rending the entire mirror lake from the fabric of the world? Would it have stolen the radiant strings of fate from which the nightmare spell was woven, perhaps? That sounded quite fantastical, but Sunny was not going to put anything past that damn bird. It had already stolen his fate, after all, so who was to say that it couldn't rend apart the nightmare spell, just for the fun of it? If anything, since the thieving bird seemed to be obsessed with all things Weaver, and the nightmare spell had been born from Weaver's soul, it was under the greatest threat should that loathsome thing escape into the world. I didn't think about that. Sunny sighed, then finally acknowledged two facts that he had been aware of from the very moment he plunged into the Great River, but was reluctant to think about until now. The first one was pretty obvious: the comfortable darkness he was enjoying was not supposed to exist inside the Tomb of Ariel. In the nightmare, the great river had been illuminated by the light of 7 suns, each forged by Ariel from the soul cores, or at least soul shards, left behind by the stone titan, the unholy horror he had killed. Those suns were nowhere in sight right now. Of course, they could have moved under the great river, plunging this stretch of it into a deep and lightless night. But then, the water itself would have been emanating a beautiful radiance, illuminated from beneath. There was no radiance. The waters of the great river were lightless, and the world was shrouded in absolute darkness. Perhaps the damn bird really did steal the suns. They were the shiniest thing in the tomb of Ariel, after all. It was bitterly cold, so cold, in fact, that Sunny could not explain why the still and dark waters around him had not turned to ice yet. And that was the second thing he had to acknowledge, the second way in which the world was wrong. The endlessly flowing waters of the great river were not flowing anymore. The water stood still, utterly unmoving, stretching in every direction like an endless flat plain. If there was a current, it was so weak that Sunny could not feel it at all. He could explain the absence of the suns, somehow, but this, he couldn't even fathom, let alone explain. The great river was not meant to stand still. That was entirely against its nature, against Ariel's design. No force was supposed to be able of making its waters stop flowing, and nobody was supposed to be capable of breaking the fundamental laws that governed this singular, strange realm. Drifting in the cold water, surrounded by utter darkness, Sunny let out a heavy sigh. I can't believe it. He had spent so much time. How long had it been, now? 6, 7 years. He had spent all those years imagining the day he would return to the tomb of Ariel. He had imagined all kinds of possible scenarios, but he still failed to predict what would really happen. Reality was utterly different from even his wildest theories. Which meant that he had no idea what to expect here, inside the tomb of Ariel. Whatever he encountered would be a complete and utter, and most likely terrifying, surprise. The only choice he had was to delve into the unknown and hope for the best. Somewhat rested, Sunny took a deep breath and finally forced himself to move. First things first, let's find Nefis. Judging by the third nightmare, she had to be close. 2921 only the present. Sunny had begun the third nightmare in the mists of the estuary. However, that was only because the Mad Prince had ended his last cycle there. In truth, Sunny was always meant to begin the nightmare in the same place where his future, supreme version fell into the great river after entering the tomb of Ariel. He was that supreme version now. The point where he had fallen into the great river roughly corresponded to the current era, which meant that Nefis had to be somewhere close by. They were contemporaries, after all. The two of them had just been separated when the chain breaker overturned, throwing them both overboard. That was why he had been able to find Nefis relatively quickly in the nightmare. That was also why they had to sail past Weave and brave the time storm before finding the chain breaker further downstream, where it must have crash-landed after losing its helmsman. Of course, Sunny wasn't sure that any of his knowledge about the great river applied anymore. It was not in a normal state, so there was really no telling what would happen and what he would encounter. Let's see. First, there was the great beast who had been Darren of the Twilight Sea once. Then, there was the black turtle, that was where Sunny had found Nefis in the nightmare. Then, there was the nightmare butterfly, the swarm of abominable krill, and countless more nightmare creatures they had to escape from. Sunny did not know what fate had befallen the Serpent King in the real tomb of Ariel, but he prepared himself for battle just in case. He hesitated for a few moments, then placed a tether on the dark waters of the great river around him. He was not sure that he could come back to the waking world from the tomb of Ariel. He wasn't sure of a lot of things, actually. But at least that way, he would know where exactly now was. Turning into a shadow and building the onyx serpent shell around himself, Sunny sent his colossal body downstream, cutting the still water with the palisade of adamantine spikes that served as his dorsal fin. That was the problem, though. The water was still, or at least flowed so slowly that he couldn't feel its current, so he had no idea where downstream was. Where the future was, and where the past was. It was as if only the present remained in the tomb of Ariel. Troublesome. For all Sunny knew, he could be moving in the opposite direction from where Nefis was. He could also be barreling toward the edges of the great river, about to be swept up by the powerful currents of the unceasing waterfall and thrown into the dark abyss of Ariel's tomb. That wasn't too dangerous, of course, since he could simply change his shape and fly back up. However, it did add time to how long he would have to keep searching before finding Nefis. And at any point, the powerful abominations of the great river could attack his battered, broken form. I wonder, Do I look as bad as Darren had looked, back there at the end? Sunny suppressed his frustration and kept swimming. Remembering the distance he had traveled in the third nightmare, he evaluated his current speed, which was incomparable to the endlessly slow crawl he had been capable of as a master, and set the time limit to how long he would continue moving in the same direction. If there was no sign of Neffys by then, he would turn back and swim for twice the amount of time. If that did not work either, he would return to the point where he had first surfaced and explore the great river slowly, moving in a widening spiral. That could take some time. In the end, however, it did not, because Neffys gave him a sign. As Sunny rushed through the boundless darkness at tremendous speed, a pillar of light suddenly shot into the dark sky in the distance, momentarily illuminating the dark expanse of the great river. Enthralled by the reflections of the beautiful white radiance on the dark water, Sunny allowed himself to drift aimlessly for several seconds and then changed direction, moving toward the vanishing light. It's strange, though. He had been ready to battle the nightmare creatures of the great river, but there seemed to be none around. Nothing had attacked him, and he had not even sensed terrifying shadows moving in the distance. It was as if there was nothing living left here. As if there were nobody alive left in the tomb of Ariel, except for Sunny and Neffys. Well, and millions of loathsome butterflies that fed on the nectar of nightmares, of course. Neffys started the nightmare on the shell of the black turtle. Darren killed it. He doesn't seem to be here this time around, so is the black turtle still alive? Would Sunny have to slay it? No, Neffys would have killed it herself already. That was an odd feeling as well. Just a few years ago, during the third nightmare, the great abominations who dwelled in the endlessly flowing waters of the river had seemed insurmountable. They had been like mythical giants, far too powerful and immense to be challenged, let alone defeated. But now, both Sunny and Neffys could easily take them on. In fact, the black turtle stood no chance against either of them, no matter what sorry state they were in. Naturally, a great monster like that was still a threat, but only if Sunny and Neffys allowed it to be. If they were on top of their game, the black turtle would inevitably fall, just like myriad other great nightmare creatures had fallen to their blades. In fact, great nightmare creatures have been nothing but a disappointment. Sunny bared his fangs, feeling amused. It was true that abominations of the great rank had not offered him the same kind of dreadful challenge as those of lesser ranks. Very few of them had been truly memorable, and only a handful managed to leave him with mental scars. There were two reasons for that. The first one was that Sunny himself had become exponentially more powerful as he climbed the ranks. At the time he became a saint, the boundless potential of his divine aspect was letting itself be known. He was also already a terror by then, soon to become a titan. The second reason was far simpler. It was the fact that Sunny had been lucky not to run into more than a handful of truly sinister Great Ones. Most of the Great Ones he faced were from Godgrave. After all, they had been born and bred by the Scarlet Jungle long after the end of the world, and were therefore different from the true horrors of the ancient past. From the creatures like the Flesh of Connacht, the Ember Queen, the Skinwalker, and the other Gate Guardians whom the Sovereigns had battled in Antarctica. So, quite ironically, the most terrifying foes of that rank Sunny had faced were supreme beings, not great ones. They were Aster, Song, and Vale. And now, the great nightmare creatures had more or less lost their chance to take a bite out of him. Because Sunny was a supreme titan now, and creatures like the black turtle did not worry him that much anymore. They were the ones who had to worry about him, instead. Why'd I feel like thinking that thought aloud just cemented the fact that I'll have to really worry about some damn great abomination soon. He cursed inwardly. Sunny felt it then. The taste of the water around him changed. It tasted of blood now. He pushed a little further and finally sensed the shadow of the black turtle in the distance. He sensed Neffys on its carapace, as well, only things were very different from how they had been in the third nightmare. Back then, Darren had killed the great monster after a fierce battle, rending a ghastly gash in its neck and tunneling inside its gargantuan body to kill the enormous abomination from within. Now, however, there was no black turtle anymore. Instead, two islands of bleeding flesh were drifting in the dark water. The impregnable shell of the colossal great monster was breached, and it was cleanly severed in two. Each half of the slain abomination spanned more than 500 meters, unleashing a deluge of blood into the great river. Neffys was near the head of the dead monster, sitting on an obsidian ridge with a small flame dancing on her hand. She's safe. Releasing the onyx serpent shell, Sunny assumed his human form and climbed onto the carapace of the black turtle, what used to be the black turtle, rather, as well. He walked over to Neffs and planted himself on the ground near her, letting out a relieved sigh. That was quite intense, wasn't it? Sunny couldn't help but smile. Some would say that his smile was unwarranted. After all, he was stuck in a tomb that stood in the middle of hell, sitting atop the bleeding corpse of a dead monster, surrounded by boundless darkness, with millions of great nightmare creatures resting on the stone walls somewhere above his head. On his way to fight a cursed terror. But what could Sunny do? He was simply too glad to find Neffis. Seeing her was enough reason to smile. He felt at peace. Neffis turned to look at him, the feeble white flame reflecting in her eyes. There was no emotion in them, just a hint of recognition. The battle must have taken a lot out of her, and it would be some time before her humanity returned. She nodded slowly. Quite intense, yes. Neffis put on a faint smile, then looked around. Some things are different. Some things never seem to change. Looking down, she stomped on the obsidian surface of the black turtle's shell lightly. I found myself atop this great monster at the start of the nightmare, as well. In fact, I seem to recall that I spent a long time here. Granted, the abomination was in one piece back then, I think it was, at least. My memory of those days is vague. I do remember being more comfortable, though. The black turtle had been cut in half, and the halves weren't quite as good at staying afloat as the entire great monster had been. So, the one they were sitting on was skewed, drowning slowly in the still water. Sunny remained silent for a few moments, hurt by the fact that she did not remember that it had been the two of them, not just her, spending time on the carapace of the black turtle back then. Sunny and Neffis had always been drawn to each other. But life had other plans, so that attraction remained sealed deep in their hearts for a long time. They were more often apart than together, and when they were side by side, there was always some dire peril either around or on the horizon, preventing them from exploring and addressing their mutual feelings. Strangely enough, Sunny felt like the days the two of them had spent on the corpse of the black turtle were where it all really started, perhaps because it was the first moment of peace they found together in the endless sea of calamities. It was here that they tentatively allowed themselves to acknowledge how they felt, even if they weren't quite willing to admit it, even to themselves. So, even if he was used to it by now, knowing that she didn't remember any of it, yet, suddenly seemed unbearable. He warned you, the Mad Prince, to be careful of what we wished for. Eventually, Sunny pushed down the unexpected bout of bitterness and looked away with a chuckle. Well, you shouldn't have cut it in half then. Splitting an enormous great monster down the middle with one blow, huh? Show off. Neffis gave him an odd look. Sunny raised an eyebrow. What? She lingered for a moment, then said in an even tone. Why do you think that it was me? Neffis shook her head. It wasn't. The black turtle was already dead when I landed, so, I have no idea what killed it. Or what could have cleaved it in half. 2922 Searching for Weave. Sunny spent some time studying the severed halves of the black turtle, a grim expression slowly finding its way onto his face. I don't like it. There was nothing strange in the fact that someone, or something, had killed a great monster. The black turtle had perished in the nightmare as well, after all. Even if it was colossal and heavily armored, more so than most abominations of that rank, Sunny would not have been surprised even by the fact that something had ripped the giant creature apart. The problem, however, was that the black turtle had not been ripped apart, it had been cut in two. The cut was so clean and even that it almost seemed flawless. The impregnable obsidian shell had been cut like paper, and even the heavy plates of silver armor adorning it failed to stall the severing blade. What kind of being could have cleaved the black turtle in two? Even Darren had not been able to break its obsidian shell. Sunny frowned. Eventually, having failed to discover any clues, he returned to Neffis. I guess the tomb of Ariel is not empty, after all. She nodded. Makes sense. Neffis fell silent for a few moments, then asked in an indifferent tone. That cursed terror we have to kill, the thieving bird. What do you know about it? Sunny gave her a bitter smile. Not that much, actually. It has existed from the dawn of time, or perhaps even from before that. I know that it was hated both by the gods and by the void creatures. It also stole a demon's eye once, and went mad as a result. Oh, and it made a nest in the heart of the estuary. The real thieving bird is long dead, but it managed to come back to life by escaping into the real world from a nightmare. He sighed and shrugged his shoulders. I guess its powers have to do with stealing things. Or concepts. Or pieces of universal laws, basically, anything it likes. And it likes shiny things the most. Neffis stared at him silently for a few moments. That doesn't really sound like a cursed terror. That bird seems more mischievous than sinister, let alone evil. Sunny scoffed. Speak for yourself. To me, it seems more odious and loathsome than any other nightmare creature. Or just any creature, really. He paused for a moment and then added reluctantly. Well, considering that the vile thieving bird was hated by void creatures, I doubt that it cares about being corrupted that much. It had to have hung around those horrors to earn their loathing, after all. So, that bird is indeed not your usual nightmare creature. That doesn't make it any less hazardous, though. If anything, it only made the thieving bird more of a disaster. Nightmare creatures, in all their demented frenzy, were at least predictable. That damn bird, however, who knew what it was going to do? Not even Weaver had known. Losing an eye is a result. Neffys hesitated for a little while, then asked. But you think that I have some kind of special power over it? Sunny took a long time to answer. In the end, he sighed. Maybe, I don't know. It has a certain something in its possession that might respond to you. If that happens, you'll be able to weaken the vile thieving bird. If not, well, we'll just have to kill it the old-fashioned way. He really did not know. The thieving bird was in possession of his fate, and while Sunny maintained the ownership of his aspect, including its innate ability, Shadow Bond being bonded to Neffys was also a part of his fate. So, the cursed terror waiting for them in the estuary of the Great River could be susceptible to her orders. Sunny looked in the direction where downstream would have been if the Great River were still flowing. So, what's our plan? Neffys shrugged. We'll rest here for a short while. Then, we will try to retrace my steps and repeat the journey I completed in the nightmare. We've fallen grace. Twilight cannot exist here, so there is no point going there. I'll guess we'll sail directly to Verge from Fallen Grace, making a stop at Windflower in the process. And sail for the estuary from Verge. Sunny remembered all those places. The forlorn desolation of Weave, the lively canals of Fallen Grace, the damn horrors of Elydia's Island. He nodded. Sounds like a plan. I do need some rest. He smiled. So, what, are we going to sleep in turns? Take shifts keeping watch. Neffys looked at him impassively. Why, do you have other ideas? Sunny grinned. Why, as a matter of fact, She was already rising to find a place to sleep, though. Sure, you do. How about you take the first watch instead? If you don't mind. Sunny suppressed a bitter sigh. What if I do mind, though? Neffys had spent most of her essence fighting the nightmare butterflies, so even if she had saved herself from complete essence exhaustion, her reserves were nearly dry, and since there was almost no one left in her domain now, she had to replenish them like an ordinary awakened would, relying on nothing but the innate capacity of her soul. Luckily, her soul was aflame with the fire, so her rate of replenishment was abnormally high. Next morning, or whatever passed for morning in the boundless darkness that surrounded them, Neffys used most of the essence she had recovered to heal Sunny. Healing a Supreme Titan was not an easy task, and it took a vast ocean of essence to mend each of his wounds, so she only managed to fix him up a little in the end. Still, it was a huge relief. Feeling less like he was about to die, Sunny assumed the shape of the onyx serpent once again and plunged into the water. Neffys had to conserve her essence, so she did not summon her radiant wings to fly high in the sky above him. Instead, she jumped onto his wide back, taking a position just behind the ridge of horns that crowned his giant head. Sunny rushed downstream, cutting the great river with his fins. A great wave rose from his passing, towering above the dark surface of the river like a fortress wall. It's funny, really, how much this resembles the past. Back then, he had swum downstream in the form of the onyx serpent, as well. He was wounded and battered, as well. Neffys stood on his onyx scales, holding onto his horns. The great river was different now, and Sunny and Neffys were different too. But so many things were the same. He wondered what else would be the same, and what would be different. Soon, they reached the point where Sunny had run out of essence in the past. That was where Ananke had met them, back then. But now, the great river was dark and still. A wooden ketch was nowhere to be found, and nobody waited for them, ready to welcome them into this odd, bizarre world. Sunny circled the waters for a while, hoping against all hope to find something, someone, but found nothing but regret and old pain. In the end, he gritted his fangs and turned away, swimming in the direction where Weave was supposed to be. Surely, it will be there, surely. In the nightmare, the people of Weave had been slaughtered by the Mad Prince. There was no Mad Prince in the real tomb of Ariel, so they could still be alive. No matter how improbable that was, Sunny still wanted to believe that they were, that someone was alive, having survived thousands of years of isolation and defilement. Even with his speed, it took them a long while to reach Weave, especially because there was no current now, and the river itself was not pushing him forward. In the process, Nephis poured her purifying flames into his massive form a few more times, soothing his pain and mending his wounds. The Shadow Legion was slowly being repaired within his soul. Saint was already almost healed, and would be able to respond to his summons soon. One of his incarnations had recovered enough to be summoned, as well, the rest were still undone, so he enjoyed the company of his shadows instead. The shadows seemed to be having a blast in the world of darkness that the great river had become, but at the same time, they seemed cautious and wary after coming very close to being destroyed twice in a short span of time. Damn, they're such cowards. Sunny was proud. There was nothing wrong with being a coward. In fact, cowards lived longer. Come to think of it, most of his problems started after he stopped being afraid all the time. Eventually, they reached the span of the great river where the House of Parting should have been floating on the water. However, there was nothing. The small island where they had shared a meal with Anenk once was gone without a trace, as if it had never existed at all. Sunny felt a painful wistfulness grip his heart. He continued downstream in silence. And eventually, they did find something in the water. For the first time since they left the severed corpse of the black turtle, something was drifting on the still black surface of the great river. It was a piece of flotsam. 2923 A dead world. Sunny almost shuddered when he sensed the flotsam, but it was not the familiar piece of wood, a piece of the chain breaker's broken hull, covered by a mad weave of runes. Instead, it was a small fragment of a thick bone plate, fractured and covered in soot. Sunny slowed down to observe the flotsam closely, then swam past it and moved further downstream. As they advanced forward slowly, there was more and more debris in the water around them. And then, they saw it. The corpses. There were dead nightmare creatures drifting in the water, cold and unmoving. Some seemed to have been crushed, the rest bore no visible wounds. One thing that united them all was that they were dead, and had been dead for a long, long time. It was just that their flesh did not rot, because the waters of the great river stood still, and therefore time had no power over them. Sunny manifested his second incarnation on the back of the first one, standing close to Nephis. What happened here? His quiet voice echoed above the dark water, spreading far and wide. Nephis remained silent for a while, then raised her hand to illuminate the dark waters around them. The feeble flame that had been burning on her palm had grown strong and blindingly radiant by then, shining like a little star. In the stark white light of the dancing flame, they could see the ghastly carcass in every gruesome detail. Eventually, she said, "It was killed by a shockwave." Sunny raised an eyebrow, while Nephis looked around with a somber expression. The nightmare creatures did not die in these waters. All of it, the debris, the corpses, rained down from the sky after being flung outward by a monstrous explosion, or at least a monstrous impact that created a devastating shockwave. Followed by an actual wave, a tsunami, really. Sunny studied their surroundings once more, forced to admit that her theory sounded correct. Few people knew more about explosions, impacts, and shockwaves than the Star of Ruin, after all. But what had caused that shockwave? And where had the impact happened? What had been caught in its epicenter? Sunny's heart felt heavy because he had an idea about what the answer to his last question was. Please, let me be wrong. But he wasn't wrong. Soon enough, they saw something towering above the surface of the water. It was one of the island ships that comprised Weave, or rather, a fragment of it, shattered and half drowned. The buildings that had littered its surface once were now piles of rubble, the orderly streets were fractured and covered in dried blood, the trees that grew in tenderly nurtured gardens had been burned, with nothing but charred stumps left in their place. There were more dead nightmare creatures floating in the water now, as well. Nephis pointed to one of them. Look. Sunny had already noticed it. Most of the corpses were the same as the ones they had seen before, but some bore more familiar wounds, wounds that had been left by harpoons, arrows, and sharp blades. There was a battle here. Nephis nodded quietly, her face turning distant and still. Yes, the city was besieged, and then, it was destroyed. Sunny's heart fell. They continued forward, encountering more and more of the same, the shattered remains of Weave, the corpses of the nightmare creatures, and an echoing emptiness left in the wake of people that weren't here anymore. It must have been a bitter battle, for the people of Weave. Because it was a battle from which they could never retreat, the river people could not move freely across the great river, after all. Going too far either downstream or upstream meant death, so they would have had to defend their city to the last drop of blood, even if they had no hope of winning. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment. He still remembered the day Ananke brought them to Weave, the pride and care the priestess of the nightmare spell felt when looking at her empty, dead city. The stories about it she had told him, hoping that he would bring them away with him and tell those who lived outside the tomb of Ariel about her people. About Weave. The city was gone now, and only its ruins remained. Eventually, even they would be swallowed by the great river, erasing the last traces of the mortals who lived and died here. He sighed. Eventually, they reached the heart of the city, what had been its heart, at least. Strangely enough, there was no debris here. No corpses were floating on the water. Instead, a vast circle of dark water stretched toward the horizon, perfectly empty and still. This was the epicenter. Neff's voice sounded dull. Sunny could see it, as well. The inconceivable shockwave that tore apart the city, killed countless nightmare creatures, and sent their giant carcasses flying across dozens of kilometers had started her in the heart of Weave. Sunny swam to the middle of the circle of empty water and stopped there for a while, looking around in silence. Neffes was silent as well, staring at the drowned ruins that surrounded them with an inscrutable expression. Eventually, she sighed. There was a woman who helped me in the nightmare, you know. A priestess of the nightmare spell. I wanted to save her, but failed. She vanished without a trace, having sacrificed herself to pave the way for me. Turning her head, she looked at Sunny and smiled bitterly. I've watched countless people die, but her death dealt me a truly painful blow. Maybe it was because she reminded me of my grandmother. Or perhaps because she looked like a child, back there at the end. Turning away, Neffes let out a quiet sigh. That was why I hoped to meet her again, in the real tomb of Ariel. But I guess, it wasn't meant to be. Sunny did not answer, because he was incapable of answering sincerely. Whatever he said would be forgotten, just like he had been, leaving Neffes to carry the burden of all these scars and losses alone. Thinking that she had been carrying them alone all along. His gaze turned downstream, where, somewhere far away, the estuary lay hidden in the mist. What do you think destroyed the city? Neffes remained silent for a long while, then said in an even tone. There is no way to tell. However, I did notice something strange. Sunny looked at her. What, exactly? Studying the ruins of Weave with a slight frown, Neffes pointed to the pulverized corpses of myriad abominations drifting in the still water. All these dead nightmare creatures. She paused for a moment and then asked. But where are the humans? Sunny frowned. Neffes continued in her usual calm tone. Where are the corpses of the humans who fought these abominations? From the moment we neared Weave until now, I haven't seen a single dead human drifting in the water. So where did all the bodies go? Sunny shivered. He did not like the sound of that, one bit. Hearing about missing corpses, he couldn't help but think about a procession of terrifying horrors. The terror of LO-49, who had been Dusk, the Sibyl of Fallen Grace once, the Soul Stealer, the Skinwalker. He remained silent for a short while, and then said quietly. Maybe they are gone, just like that priestess you spoke about was gone. Perhaps the ruins of Weave drifted too far downstream, and they all vanished. Neffes frowned. But there is no downstream now. The great river is not flowing anymore. Sunny sighed. Then, I don't know. She looked at the Forlogien, broken ruins of Weave once more and then turned away. There is nothing here for us to find. Let us leave, let's try to find Fallen Grace. Maybe we will find an answer there. Sunny nodded. At the same time, he lowered his giant head down to the water and moved his enormous body, cutting across the still water. They left the ruins of Weave the same way they found them, empty and forlorn. The suns were gone, and the great river stood still. The only things they had encountered here were dead and broken, and nothing challenged the boundless silence but the sound of their own voices. Swimming away from Weave, Sunny could not help but feel that he had found himself in a place that no mortal should ever have seen. That he had entered a dead world, the frozen fragment of a ruined world that remained, still and unchanging, after the end of time. Like a dark image on a length of film left to collect dust in the reel, never to see the light of the projector and come to life once again. And once that thought entered his mind, he couldn't help but think about something else, as well. Would the whole world look like that, one day, if they failed to stop the nightmare? Sunny gritted his fangs. We'd better not fail, then. He had been telling himself that quite often lately.